It was a cold, gray morning in Moscow. Snow drifted lazily across the windshield of a beat-up taxi waiting near Vnukovo International Airport. The driver, a stocky white Russian man in his late 40s, leaned against the wheel, chain-smoking, cursing under his breath about too many foreigners these days. Then his phone pinged. A new ride request. Destination. The Kremlin. He muttered in Russian, "Of course. Always the rich ones," and accepted it. Minutes later, a tall black man, wearing a dark winter coat, simple trousers, and worn leather gloves, approached the vehicle. No briefcase, no security. Just a quiet, calm presence. The driver looked him up and down. "You sure you got the right car, my friend?" he said in broken English, sneering. "Kremlin? You?" The man nodded politely. "Yes, I have a meeting." The driver rolled his eyes and laughed. "Another African looking for gold in Russia, huh? Kremlin doesn't take walk-ins." But the man didn't respond. He simply sat in the back, closed the door, and looked out into the snow-covered city. What the driver didn't know, what he never imagined, was that this quiet man in the back seat was not just another traveler. He was Ibrahim Traore, president of Burkina Faso, and he wasn't heading to the Kremlin to beg. He was invited, personally, by President Vladimir Putin for a private state meeting. But for the next 40 minutes, the driver would speak to him like a nobody. And by the time they reached the gates of power, he'd find out exactly who he was talking to, in a way he'd never forget. The taxi pulled out onto the snowy roads of Moscow. Inside, the driver turned up the heat and the radio. Loud Russian rock music filled the car. He didn't ask the passenger if it was okay. He didn't care. In the rearview mirror, he kept glancing back at the man in the back seat. His dark skin, his quiet posture, his silence. "So tell me," he said with a grin, "why you Africans always coming to Russia these days? Looking for something we don't have?" No answer. The man simply kept looking out the window, watching the white streets roll past. The driver chuckled. "What? No English? No Russian? Just silence? You think because you wear long coat, you important?" Still no reply. The disrespect got bolder. He drove faster, hit potholes without slowing down, and muttered under his breath things like, "They send us your immigrants. Now they send us your leaders too." At one point, the man in the back politely said, "Please slow down, it's icy." The driver snapped, "You don't tell me how to drive. You think this your country?" And still, the man didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply folded his hands and stared ahead. Calm, still, patient. Because he had something the driver didn't. Discipline. But the moment they approached the Kremlin gates, everything changed. Uniformed guards with earpieces stepped forward. The driver slowed, confused. "Wait, what? You really going in there?" No answer. Just the sound of security radios crackling, and the guards were moving fast. The taxi rolled to a stop just meters from the gates of the Kremlin. The driver's eyes darted from the snow-covered cobblestones to the armed Russian guards approaching the vehicle. Something was wrong. He could feel it, but his ego was louder than his instinct. He turned around to the man in the back seat and growled, "You didn't tell me who you really are. You lied." The man remained calm. He reached slowly into his coat to pull out his wallet, ready to pay the fare. But the driver snapped. "No, no money!" he shouted, now furious and panicking. "You tricked me! You think you're better than me? Coming here like a king?" And then he did the unthinkable. With rage in his face, the driver lunged into the back seat, grabbed the man by the collar, and yanked him forward with both hands. "Who do you think you are?" he yelled. In that instant, everything stopped. The guards watching from the front dropped their radios. One of them shouted into his mic, "Stand down! He's grabbing the president! Move!" In a flash, 3 Kremlin guards sprinted toward the car. Within seconds, the door flew open. The driver was yanked backward, pinned to the pavement by a boot to the chest. Guns were drawn. One guard barked, "You laid hands on the president of Burkina Faso. Are you insane?" The driver's face turned white. President." His hands shook. His lips parted, but no words came out. The man he had insulted, mocked, and assaulted stepped out of the taxi, dusted snow off his coat, and stood tall in the cold Russian wind. President Ibrahim Traore looked at the driver and said, "Sometimes it takes a hand on your throat to reveal the real you." And then he turned and walked toward the Kremlin gates, without saying another word. As President Ibrahim Traore walked through the Kremlin gates, flanked by elite Russian guards, the air behind him was still charged with shock. The taxi driver lay face down on the icy pavement, handcuffed, surrounded by 3 armed men. The same mouth that had shouted insults was now begging in broken whispers. I didn't know who he was." But it was too late. Inside the Kremlin, a private chamber had already been prepared. And waiting inside, watching a live security feed from the gate, was President Vladimir Putin. He had seen everything. The footage, the disrespect, the violence, the collar grab, was already being reviewed by Russian intelligence. Protocol had been breached. Not just any foreign guest had been attacked, but a visiting African head of state, one who had been personally invited. Putin rose from his chair and said coldly to his aide, "Bring me a report. That driver doesn't work in Moscow again. In fact, he may not walk free in it either." Minutes later, Traoré entered the room. No complaints, no demands, just presence. Putin extended his hand. "Mr. President, I deeply apologize. What happened outside is not Russia. That was one man's ignorance, and Russia will not tolerate it." Traoré shook his hand, nodded respectfully, and replied, "It's not the first time I've been judged by how I dress, but it may be the last time he does it to anyone." The conversation moved on to matters of diplomacy, defense, cooperation. But the moment at the gates lingered in the halls of the Kremlin, like a storm cloud refusing to pass. Outside, the taxi driver was officially detained, charged with assaulting a protected foreign head of state. And in the streets of Moscow, word was already spreading. "Did you hear? A taxi driver attacked a president, a real president, the African one." But they hadn't seen the whole story yet, because by the time the footage leaked, the internet would do the rest. By the next morning, the security footage was everywhere. A grainy clip, leaked by a Kremlin staffer, showed the exact moment the Russian taxi driver grabbed Ibrahim Traore by the collar, and the instant Kremlin guards tackled him to the ground. Someone added subtitles, someone else added music, someone wrote a caption. They thought he was just another African, until the guards saluted him. And just like that, the world woke up to the story. On TikTok, it hit 1 million views in 3 hours. On Twitter, African voices exploded with anger, pride, and disbelief. In Burkina Faso, the footage played on loop on every screen, from city cafes to village TVs. "They disrespected our lion," one man said, "and he didn't even raise his voice." Social media turned it into a rallying cry. Hashtags trended globally. He was the president, your hands off Africa, Traoré in Russia, respect black leaders, you grabbed the wrong man. Even Russian citizens began debating the event. Some defended their country, ashamed of the driver's behavior. Others posted apologies. "We are sorry, President Traoré. This is not who we want to be." In Africa, though, the message was deeper. This wasn't just about racism. It wasn't just about one man's ignorance. It was about how the world still sees African leadership, and how easily respect disappears when power isn't worn on the outside. One Nigerian commentator said, "They would never grab a European diplomat by the collar, but they thought this African was just a driver in the back seat." But they were wrong, because that driver turned out to be the president of a rising African power, And the way he stayed calm, the way he stood silent while others shouted, was what made the world take notice. The only thing left was what Traoré himself would say, and when he spoke, the world would listen. 2 days after the incident, the world was still buzzing. News anchors in Africa, Europe, and even Asia were reporting on the African president manhandled by Russian taxi driver. Everyone had seen the video, everyone had formed an opinion. But through all the noise, one voice was missing, Ibrahim Traoré's. Until now. On the final night of his visit to Moscow, Traoré agreed to speak. Not at a formal Kremlin press event, not behind a row of flags, but on a small platform outside the Burkina embassy, with only 2 microphones, a plain backdrop, and hundreds of Africans, students, workers, families, waiting in the snow to hear him. He stepped forward. No suit, no gold medals. Just his dark coat, the same one he wore in that taxi, and the quiet strength that had shaken an entire continent. He looked out into the cold and began. Many have asked me how I stayed calm, why I didn't shout, push back, or demand justice on the spot. He paused. Because I don't need to roar to be heard. The lion knows who he is, even in silence. Applause rose from the crowd. What happened to me happens to my people every day, disrespected, judged, handled like they're less than human, just because they don't wear a title or carry a flag or speak your language. But the world must understand something now. Our value is not in how loud we speak, it's in how long we stand. Then he turned to the cameras and delivered the line that would shake the internet. That man didn't grab my collar. He grabbed the collar of every African leader who came before me. He grabbed the throat of every child told they don't belong, and that's why he fell. The crowd erupted. In Ouagadougou, the clip played live on national TV. In Senegal, students painted murals of Traoré walking away from the taxi with the quote underneath, "The lion does not need to fight to win." In South Africa, a viral post read, "He didn't ask for revenge, he gave the world a lesson." Even in Russia, the driver's case became a warning. President Putin himself ordered a full review of foreign diplomatic protection procedures and declared, Russia will never again allow a guest of Africa to be treated with disrespect on Russian soil. But Traoré, he didn't ask for a law. He didn't ask for compensation. He left something far more valuable, dignity. Because when you carry yourself with truth, even in a stranger's car, you don't need a crown to remind the world who you are.